As excitement fades, excuses grow louder, the mind begins to negotiate. Missing one prayer, delaying Qur'an, easing self-control, or just this once. The second week is where these negotiations either become habits or are shut down. Spiritual discipline means refusing to bargain with obedience. It means understanding that consistency is built through repetition, not inspiration. This week trains the soul to obey without needing to feel inspired to do so. The absence of excitement also reveals dependency. If worship collapses without emotional energy, then it was never stable to begin with. But if worship remains steady, even at a quieter pace, it shows grounding. The second week teaches that faith is not sustained by emotional spikes, but by intentional routines. It invites recalibration. Smaller goals, steadier effort, deeper focus. Instead of chasing the rush of the first days, the believer learns to value reliability. Discipline developed in the second week extends beyond Ramadan. Life itself rarely provides sustained excitement. Responsibilities are repetitive, struggles are ongoing, and progress is often invisible. Ramadan's second week mirrors real life. It trains the soul for long-term faithfulness, not short bursts of devotion. Learning to worship without novelty prepares the heart to remain obedient when circumstances are ordinary or difficult. There is also humility in this phase. Excitement can inflate self-perception, a sense of spiritual achievement or confidence. When excitement fades, humility returns. One realizes how much effort obedience truly requires. This humility is protective. It softens judgment toward others and deepens reliance on divine help. The second week teaches that without support, discipline weakens, and that reliance is not weakness but wisdom. Importantly, discipline does not mean perfection. It means returning, correcting, and continuing. The second week allows for mistakes to be noticed and addressed. Missed goals can be adjusted. Unrealistic schedules can be simplified. The focus shifts from impressing oneself to sustaining oneself. This is where mercy meets effort. The second week is not about doing more, it is about doing what can be maintained. The fading of excitement also creates space for sincerity. When worship is no longer thrilling, it becomes honest. The heart is less distracted by how worship feels and more attentive to why it is done. This sincerity deepens repentance, sharpens awareness of shortcomings, and strengthens resolve. Quiet acts done consistently outweigh loud acts done briefly. The second week ingrains this truth into practice. By forcing the believer to rely on discipline rather than emotion, the second week refines the relationship with worship itself. Worship becomes an anchor instead of a wave. It stabilizes rather than excites. This stability is what allows the final stretch of Ramadan to be meaningful. Without it, the last 10 days become exhausting rather than transformative. The second week is not a decline, it is a descent into depth. It moves faith from surface energy to rooted commitment. It proves that real spiritual strength is not shown in how passionately one begins, but in how faithfully one continues when passion is gone. The habits formed during the second week of Ramadan often determine the shape of the entire month. By this point, the body has adapted to fasting, and the shock of schedule changes has settled. What remains is rhythm. Actions repeated now no longer feel experimental. They begin to feel normal. This is why the second week is so decisive. Behaviors practiced here, whether consistency in prayer, regular Qur'an recitation, controlled speech, or mindful use of time, tend to solidify and carry forward. The soul starts to accept these actions as its default state for Ramadan, not temporary efforts. Early in the month, people often operate on ambition. They aim high, set aggressive goals, and push themselves with optimism. In the second week, ambition either becomes structured or collapses. Unrealistic goals begin to strain, while practical routines begin to emerge. This adjustment is not failure, it is wisdom forming. Sustainable habits are not built through pressure, but through repetition that respects human limits. The second week encourages recalibration, choosing what can be maintained daily rather than what looks impressive briefly. Habits formed now also shape focus. If distractions are left unchecked in the second week, they tend to dominate the rest of the month. If time wasting is justified now, it becomes normalized later. But if boundaries are reinforced, limiting idle scrolling, guarding sleep, prioritizing worship windows, those boundaries strengthen with time. The second week quietly trains attention. It teaches what the heart turns to when novelty fades. That direction often remains until the end of Ramadan. Consistency in small actions becomes especially powerful here. A few pages of Qur'an read daily in the second week often outlasts a large but inconsistent reading plan from the first. A modest but regular charity habit often survives longer than one-time generosity. The second week teaches that habits are not built by intensity but by loyalty to repetition. What the soul practices repeatedly begins to feel incomplete when missing. This sense of absence is the sign that a habit has taken root. The second week also exposes whether habits are chosen consciously or inherited passively. Social Ramadan begins to thin out. Fewer gatherings, fewer reminders, fewer collective moments. What continues now is usually what was personally prioritized. This clarity allows intentional habit building. One begins to see which acts of worship were truly valued and which were simply carried along by environment. The second week gives space to claim ownership over one's Ramadan rather than borrowing momentum from others. As habits settle, energy often dips, and this dip becomes a test of sincerity of intention. Physical fatigue accumulates, sleep debt grows, mental sharpness dulls. The excitement that once energized worship fades, leaving behind effort without emotional payoff. This is where intention is examined. When energy is low, motives surface. If worship continues, it suggests that intention is anchored beyond feeling. If worship collapses, it signals that intention may have been tied to comfort or enthusiasm. Low energy strips worship down to its core. There is less room for performance, less desire to be seen, less capacity for excess. What remains is choice. Choosing to pray while tired, to restrain anger while hungry, to recite Qur'an when the mind wanders. These choices are heavy, but they are honest. The second week teaches that sincerity is not proven when worship is easy, but when it is inconvenient. Energy dips also challenge expectations. Many enter Ramadan expecting continuous spiritual highs. When those highs fade, disappointment can set in. This disappointment is dangerous if misunderstood. It can lead to guilt, self-criticism, or disengagement. But the second week reframes this experience. It teaches that the absence of emotional intensity does not mean the absence of reward. In fact, deeds done during fatigue often carry greater sincerity because they are done despite resistance. This phase forces a confrontation with why worship is done. Is it for inner satisfaction or for obedience? When energy is low, worship no longer feeds the ego or emotion. It becomes purely an act of submission. This purity strengthens intention. The second week removes hidden conditions placed on worship. Conditions like I will pray as long as it feels uplifting, or I will read Qur'an as long as I feel focused. When these conditions are stripped away, intention is refined. Fatigue also exposes reliance. When energy is high, one may unconsciously rely on personal strength. When energy dips, that illusion fades. One becomes aware of dependence on divine assistance. This awareness deepens humility. Supplication becomes more honest. Requests become simpler. The second week teaches that intention is not just about starting an act for the right reason, but about continuing it while recognizing personal weakness. Importantly, sincerity during low energy does not mean pushing beyond capacity. Islam does not demand burnout. The second week teaches balance. Sincere intention includes recognizing limits and adjusting wisely. Reducing quantity while preserving consistency is often more sincere than forcing unsustainable effort. The key is not how much is done, but whether what is done is maintained with honesty and care. Energy dips also reveal emotional fasting. Patience becomes harder. Irritability surfaces more easily. Controlling reactions now requires conscious restraint. This restraint is part of intention. Fasting is not only from food, but from harmful responses. The second week tests whether fasting is understood in this fuller sense. Holding back anger, sarcasm, and complaint when tired is a quiet but powerful form of worship. As habits and intention are tested together, the second week becomes a filter. What passes through it tends to last. What falls away was likely built on unstable ground. This filtering is not meant to discourage. It is meant to refine. The second week reshapes Ramadan from an emotional experience into a disciplined practice. It strengthens habits that align with sincere intention and weakens those driven by impulse. By the time the third week approaches, the soul carries what it has trained. Habits either support worship or sabotage it. Intention is either clarified or confused. The second week is where this outcome is decided, not loudly, not dramatically, but through daily choices made while energy is low and attention is strained. What survives this phase does so because it is rooted, and what is rooted has the strength to carry the believer through the rest of Ramadan and beyond. When novelty fades from worship, sincerity begins to surface. In the early days of Ramadan, worship often feels fresh and emotionally rewarding. New routines, changed schedules, and heightened spiritual atmosphere give acts of devotion a sense of excitement. Prayer feels lighter, Qur'an recitation feels energizing, and fasting feels meaningful simply because it is new. But novelty is temporary by nature. By the second week, worship no longer benefits from that initial rush. What once felt special now feels normal, and what felt effortless now demands intention. This shift is not a loss. It is a purification. Worship without novelty removes many hidden motivations. Acts of devotion are exciting. They can quietly feed the ego or emotions. One may enjoy the feeling of being disciplined, spiritual, or productive. When that feeling disappears, worship becomes less about how it feels and more about why it is done. Continuing to pray, fast, and recite when there is no emotional reward refines sincerity. The heart learns to act not for stimulation or self-satisfaction, but for obedience itself. This is where worship becomes quieter, heavier, and more honest. Without novelty, worship also becomes more focused. Emotional excitement can sometimes distract from presence. A person may feel spiritually high while the mind wanders. In the second week, when worship slows down, attention is tested. Prayers feel longer. Quran recitation feels heavier. This difficulty invites deeper engagement. One must consciously fight distraction rather than being carried by emotion. This struggle increases awareness and intentionality, turning routine actions into deliberate acts of devotion. Worship without novelty also reveals endurance. Anyone can worship when it feels rewarding, but sincerity is proven when worship continues despite dryness. Dryness is not a spiritual failure, it is a stage. It teaches the soul to remain loyal even when it receives nothing in return. This loyalty is deeply valued because it mirrors real-life faith. Life does not constantly provide spiritual highs. Faith must survive ordinary days, emotional fatigue, and internal resistance. The second week trains the soul for that reality. As novelty fades, worship becomes simpler. Grand goals may be scaled back. Long sessions may be shortened. What remains is what can be maintained. This simplicity is not weakness, it is maturity. Sincere worship does not need to be impressive. It needs to be consistent and honest. A small amount done daily with presence outweighs large amounts done briefly with excitement. The second week teaches this through experience, not theory. Closely connected to this sincerity is the distinction between routine fasting and conscious fasting. By the second week, fasting can easily become mechanical. Hunger comes at expected times. Thirst is familiar. Breaking the fast follows a pattern. When fasting becomes routine, it risks losing its inner purpose. One may abstain from food while the heart remains unguarded, the tongue remains loose, and the behavior remains unchanged. The second week exposes this risk clearly. Routine fasting is physical compliance. Conscious fasting is spiritual awareness. Routine fasting asks, "Have I eaten?" Conscious fasting asks, "How am I behaving?" In the second week, the body no longer protests loudly. Hunger is manageable. This quiet allows the soul to either wake up or fall asleep. If attention is not renewed, fasting becomes background noise rather than a transformative act. The second week challenges the believer to reintroduce consciousness into something that now feels automatic. Conscious fasting requires intention throughout the day, not just at dawn. It involves remembering why food is withheld and what else should be restrained. Speech becomes more important. Anger becomes more dangerous. Impatience becomes more visible. When fasting is routine, these inner dimensions are often neglected. The second week forces awareness because irritability often increases as fatigue accumulates. How one responds in these moments reveals whether fasting is merely physical or deeply conscious. This distinction also affects how time is used. Routine fasting may lead to passive days spent waiting for iftar. Conscious fasting treats the fasting hours as sacred time. The second week invites this shift. Since hunger is no longer shocking, time awareness must replace novelty. One begins to ask whether fasting hours are being protected or wasted, whether attention is being sharpened or dulled. Dole. Conscious fasting transforms waiting into watching, watching the heart, the tongue, and the mind. Routine fasting often seeks relief as quickly as possible. Conscious fasting seeks meaning. In the second week, one may become preoccupied with food planning, iftar anticipation, and physical comfort. While these are natural, they can overshadow the purpose of fasting if left unchecked. Conscious fasting restores balance. It allows enjoyment of nourishment without obsession and comfort without indulgence. The second week trains moderation by reminding the believer that fasting is not a countdown but a state of discipline. Conscious fasting also deepens empathy. As hunger becomes familiar rather than dramatic, it becomes easier to overlook its lesson. The second week revives that lesson through reflection rather than sensation. One begins to understand hunger not as discomfort to escape, but as a reminder of dependence and humility. This awareness fosters compassion, gratitude, and generosity. Routine fasting dulls this lesson. Conscious fasting preserves it. Importantly, conscious fasting does not mean constant intensity. It means awareness within limitation. One will still feel tired, distracted, and imperfect. Conscious fasting simply means returning attention again and again. The second week provides repeated opportunities for this return. Each lapse becomes a reminder. Each moment of awareness strengthens the habit of mindfulness. Over time, fasting becomes an internal discipline rather than a physical restriction. When worship loses novelty and fasting risks becoming routine, the second week stands as a corrective. It invites sincerity over excitement and consciousness over automation. It teaches that true worship is not sustained by feeling special, and true fasting is not defined by hunger alone. What develops in this phase is depth, the kind that does not announce itself but quietly reshapes the heart through steady, intentional practice.